Hi there, this is Sandra from the Schwalben's Nest. Welcome to my Christmas series. The first thing I'm going to do for this project is dye some of my Sola wood flowers. I've got a bunch of the little mini ones and I've just grabbed a few different varieties so I could make them a beautiful green color. I've got a little bit of water in a jar and now I'm squeezing in about the same amount of paint. You can do less or more paint depending on how deep you want your color to be. I put my solo wood flowers on a bamboo skewer and then I dip them into the water and kind of swish them around a little bit until they are totally submerged. Then I just tap off the excess and put them aside to dry. This is a cardboard tube that I started wrapping with nautical rope and hot glue. And I'm just grabbing another piece. I went through about 1.5 packages from the Dollar Tree. Now, this cardboard tube is super sturdy and it's very heavy and it can stand on its own. So, if you're going to repeat this project that I'm doing with these large pine cones, you're going to want something really sturdy in the center. I've got these extra large and long pine cones that I foraged last year at my cottage. They've been sitting in my garage, so there aren't any bugs or anything in them. And what I'm going to do is just hot glue them to the jute twine. And that's the reason why I wrapped this cardboard tube. I wanted to make sure that the pine cones would have something really easy to stick to. I separated all of the pine cones before I started into a small, medium, large batch, and I'm starting with the large ones down at the bottom because I want this to be a Christmas tree and I want it to gradually get smaller towards the top. There was quite a bit of a gap down underneath these large pine cones, and if I would have been thinking a little bit better, I probably would have glued these small ones on first, but they're also going to help support the larger ones. So I'm just going to go underneath here now very carefully and glue some of the small size pine cones right underneath the large ones. And you can see that I'm staggering them here. I want this to be sort of what's called a brick lay pattern. So you're going to just do the opposite of what you did before, so none of the pine cones are sitting exactly on top of each other. So here I am using the next style of pine cone. I ran out of the really large ones, but that's okay because I wanted to change this up and make some smaller ones anyhow. But I'm doing the same thing. I'm making sure that they kind of curl out at the bottom, and I'm just giving them a nice bit of hot glue and then placing them on the jute twine. And I'm going to continue to build on this tree until I get to the very top. At the top, to cover up the hole in the cylinder, I'm going to put the hot glue towards the middle of the pine cones and have them leaning in a little bit more so I can create a peak at the top of my tree. Then at the very top of the tree, I'm going to close it in a little bit more by gluing the pine cones on top of each other. Again, making sure that I have somewhat of a brick lay pattern so I don't put any pine cones right on top of each other. So here's the view of my tree so far. And now I'm taking some of these sort of medium-sized pine cones and I'm pushing them in between the larger ones just to give it a little bit more fullness. There were also some spots where you could see the jute rope and I wanted to camouflage that. But this also gives the tree a little bit more texture and color. Here at the top of my tree, you can see that the texture is kind of the same. There's some different colors, but I'm adding in some of these little tiny pine cones from the Dollar Tree and giving this a little bit of a better look. I want to kind of break up how these pine cones are sitting, so this will just really help with that. When you're working with projects like this, you just want to take a look at how it looks to you. If it looks great like this, you just leave it alone. If you want to add a little bit more texture like I'm doing, then you just keep adding until you love it. The way I gauge my projects is if I would have this displayed in my own home, then definitely I will be good with it. If something works out not as good as I thought it would work out and I wouldn't display it in my home, then I don't put it up on YouTube either. I want to give you guys some really high-end quality detailed projects to see and hopefully recreate. To make a top for this tree, I glued this large size pine cone right on the top. And then I'm going to take some of the Dollar Tree pine cones again, those little ones, and just push them underneath to give this larger pine cone a little bit more support and also fill in any of the gaps. Now it's time to add the Sola wood flowers, and I've got about 7 of them, I think, that I dyed, and I'm just going to be placing them randomly around the tree, mostly towards the front, but I am going to do a couple at the back. And I'm putting the larger flowers at the bottom, and then I'll gradually move up to the smaller ones at the top. To add even more color and texture, I'm adding these long needle pine picks. I'll have a link to those on Amazon in my description box. And I'm just going to kind of put them in sporadically. I think I used 6 or 7 of them as well. Just kind of place them around the tree where I thought they would look good. For the top, the long needle pine picks were too large and I didn't want to cut them down. So I'm taking some other similar pine little picks. These just came from my stash and I'm just going to add them around the very top of the tree so the greenery kind of looks the same all the way around. The cylinder tree could stand on its own, but there was a little bit of pressure on the bottom pine cones, and I didn't want them to break. So I took a piece of scrap wood and this bedpost spindle, and I'm going to glue the two pieces together. The top part of this bedpost spindle fits perfectly inside the cylinder tree. I'm just going to use my pencil and I'm going to mark the center, and then I'm going to use my Weldbond glue to glue this in place. After about 10 minutes, the Weldbond glue is fairly set, and you can go ahead and work on your project without fear of it falling apart. But you still have to be really careful with it. I decided to grab this maple wood stain, and because it has a little bit of red tint to it, I thought it would be a good match for the spindle. However, I didn't like it because when I wiped off the stain, it was still too light. So I ended up just taking my regular burnt umber acrylic paint, painting right on top of the bare wood, and then I dry brushed a little bit onto the spindle so it would look similar in color. Then all I had to do was add the tree right on top of the spindle, and it is gorgeous. You've got to let me know what you think of this one. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed to my channel. I really appreciate it. If you are new to my channel, I would love it if you could hit that red button too. For this project, I'm using some of this birch bark wrapping paper, and I picked up these 2 trees that actually fit together to make a 3-dimensional tree. They're these wooden die cuts from Dollarama, and it was $2.50 for the pack. So I'm just using my glue stick, and then I'm going to glue on the birch bark paper, and I'm going to need to do that on both sides and both trees. I like to press my project on top of the paper because that just makes it easier to work with. Using a really sharp craft knife, I'm going to go around and just cut all of the excess paper off. And then I'm going to use my sandpaper just to get all of those little rounded edges. So this was a very tedious part of this project, but I think it was worth it. One of the important things to remember is to cut out those little center pieces where the 2 trees fit together. So I almost forgot to do this a couple of times, but I'll have to repeat the process 4 times so I get both sides of each tree covered. I'm going to cut off the star of this tree because I have something else in mind. So I'm just using my miter shears, and I can very easily just follow the line of the very top of the tree and snip the star off. Now it's time to put the 2 pieces together. You just slide them through, and I just was very careful to make sure that I didn't rip any of the paper. So when I got to the joint, as you can see right there, I just kind of pulled the one part apart a little bit, and then I was able to push it up very easily. Since my footage at the beginning of the video was really bad at showing you how I dye these flowers, I thought I would do this properly. I just take a bamboo skewer, I push it in the end of the flower, and then dip it in. I'm going to swish the paint around. I never make a ton of paint for these because I only use a little bit at a time. So I just tip the jar and move the flower around to make sure that everything is covered. Then I'm just going to go ahead and tap off the excess and then set it aside to dry. These turn out so beautiful when you dye them. They're just so pretty. I have a link down in my description box to the Sola Wood Flower website. They always have some amazing sales, and I think there's one for 70% off some items right now. So go take a look. This is how I make my cones. I use some cardstock and some tape. You can also use some hot glue. What I'm going to do is create a collar for this Christmas tree. So once I get this cone done, I'm going to trim it down until I get the size that I need to fit the bottom of the tree. The nautical rope that I'm using is not the jute color. It's more of a white cotton rope, more of an off-white. And I thought that would blend in with the tree really nicely. So I'm going to use a generous amount of hot glue and make sure that I glue all of this rope onto the paper. Because this is paper, it's really flexible and it's going to kind of bend around a little bit. So I'm just going to make it much more sturdy by adding the hot glue all the way around. Before I finished creating the collar for the tree, I decided that I needed a much more sturdier base that I could glue the wood tree onto as well. So I'm taking one of these wood rounds that I get at Dollarama in a pack of 5, and I'm just going to cut out that traced circle. I'm just going to use a utility knife to score it and snap it, and I'll continue doing that until I have it all done. Then I'm just going to take some sandpaper and smooth around the edges just so there's nothing sharp. Using some more hot glue and quite a generous amount, I'm going to put some on the wood slice and then attach these two pieces together. I'm going to place the tree inside the collar. I just had to wiggle it just a wee bit, so it was a good thing that I used the paper. It was a little bit more flexible. Then I'm just going to put a pile of hot glue on either side of the wood stem, and that will hold it in place for me. Now I can continue gluing the rope onto itself, making it a little smaller each time I go around. Once I hit the bottom of the tree branches, that's where I'm going to stop. I'm going to use some of these little picks to camouflage the holes in the collar. So I'm just going to push a couple of them in each of these 4 spots. Then I'm going to add some pine cones as well. And at the very top of the tree, instead of a star, I'm going to glue on 4 pine cones. And then that beautiful green Sola wood flower is going to be the masterpiece on top of this tree. I really love how this tree turned out in the end. I was a little questioning myself as I was going through, but I think it was a success. I truly hope you enjoyed these projects today, and if you did, please give me a thumbs up. That gets me noticed on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate each and every one of you. I wish you all a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one.